All right. So, welcome everybody. A little bit about our speaker, Emilio. Emilio Escudero is founding and a very active member of our NorCal chapter of American Pilgrims on the Camino. He served on the American Pilgrims Board of Directors and continues to support the work of chapters all around the country. He is a retired psychotherapist. He began walking the Camino in 2007, and he loves medieval Spanish history. He likes to take pictures, and in many presentations he has made, he shares his pictures and insights on what it means to be a pilgrim. We are so lucky to have him offering basic Spanish for the Camino to our Northern California chapter. And when we're not under quarantine, he gives great tours of Berkeley and the UC Berkeley campus where he went to school. Go Bears! So without further ado, let's hand the mic over to Emilio Escudero.
Thank you, Laurie. Thank you very much. It's great to see so many people interested in the Templars now. This is really a fascinating story. Welcome. My name is Emilio Escudero, and this is a great turnout. It's my pleasure to be here with you this afternoon. I'm going to turn on a PowerPoint presentation, which hopefully will come up. All right. Okay. I'll be talking today about the militant religious order of the Knights Templar. They're also known as the Knights of the Temple. We'll explore their origins, and we'll focus on the last 50 years or so of their existence, the years of their undoing. I'll talk to you about a pope, a king, and a Grand Master, whose interests all collided and brought about the downfall of the Templars. I'll touch on the legacy of the Templars, especially as it relates to the Camino de Santiago. Our meeting today, as mentioned earlier, is sponsored by the NorCal chapter of the American Pilgrims on the Camino. And we scheduled this meeting to happen today on Friday the 13th for a reason, and that's because this date is a significant date for our story. You'll soon see. All right. If you see this slide, or when you see this slide, it's just that I've turned off the PowerPoint presentation. Along the Camino de Santiago, at one time or another, you're likely to have run across references to the Knights Templar or to Jacques de Molay or Friday the 13th. I may not be able to see everyone, but can I see a show of hands of the people who, anyone who has had or seen a reference to the Knights Templar along the Camino? All right, yeah, great. Well, during our Q&A at the end of the talk, I'd like to hear from all of you. And please do contribute because it'll add a lot to this presentation. I have a disclaimer to make early on, and that is that I love history, especially the Renaissance and the Middle Ages, but I'm not an historian. And this means that my personal likes and dislikes will probably color my story. But I've been careful to not change or alter any of the facts. Like any story, it's important to first set the scene. It's important to have both a temporal and an historical context. We need to know the years that frame the story and have a sense of what was going on at the time. And we also need to know the characters. And finally, we need to know how the characters and our time frame come together to unfold into a story that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Let's start first with the characters of our story. And I like to think spatially. So let me point to where they are. On this side of the room are the Templars. The Templars were men. Most of them were knights, and they belonged to a militant religious order that was established in the year. Let me just make sure I know where I am. They were established at the end of the First Crusade in the year 1099. Over here behind me, we have Philip IV, the King of France, who was not a very nice guy. He was called the Fair, Philip the Fair, because when he became king at 17, we're told that he was a handsome young man. And although he was called the Fair, he was not a fair or a just man. He was actually called the Iron King. And he was an able ruler, but he was a bit of a bully and not an all-around nice person. All right, so we have the Templars, we have Philip, and on this side of the room we have our wimpy Pope of the story. Do you know the word toady? Toady means obsequious, submissive, servile, fawning, subservient. All these words pretty accurately describe Bertrand de Got, the French bishop who, when he became Pope, took the name Clement V. And finally, in front of me, on this side of the room, is our main character, if you want, our hero, Jacques de Molay. Jacques de Molay was a brave man, a good person, some say even saintly. And when he was 21 years old, he was knighted and at the same time was received into the Order of the Templars, which had been in existence at that time for about 130 years. Now, spoiler alert, Jacques de Molay had a tragic end, and he fell prey to, actually he and the Templars fell prey to the treachery of Philip on this side and Clement over there. So let's review our characters, just to make sure we know who they are. We have the Knights Templar. We have Philip the Fourth of France. We have Clement V, the Pope in those final years of the Templars. And we have the Grand Master of the Templars, Jacques de Molay. Now, let's set the time frame of our story. And the time frame actually predates the Templars. It runs roughly from the 6th to the 14th centuries. That's a span of about 800 years. To be more specific, let's create some temporal bookends. On the one end of our time frame, we have the birth of Muhammad. Muhammad was 62 years old when he died, and he died in the year 632. So that's generally our earliest time frame, Muhammad. And on the other end of our time frame, we have the 14th century, and specifically the year 1314. This was the year that Jacques de Molay, Philip, and Clement all died in the same year, 1314. All right, now that we have our characters and our time frame, let's begin the story. And we'll begin here with the Knights Templar themselves. The Templars came into being because of the Crusades. The order was established in 1129 30 years after the First Crusade had succeeded in recapturing Jerusalem. Um, and here's some stories. Here's some pictures of the warrior knights. This is a medieval representation of the Templars. Um, here's a representation that would be more like a Hollywood movie. And these representations are idealized a bit, but they do show you the armor and the armament of a typical Templar knight. The Templars did go into battle sometimes on foot, but they mainly rode on these huge war ponies. Now, the motto of the Templars was this. If you're rusty on your Latin, but just think it's non nobis domine, non nobis, sed nomini tuo da gloriam, which, Dick, you probably know this, not unto us, Lord, not unto us, but in your name give glory. The Templars were intimately connected to the Crusades. And to understand the Crusades, you need to know a few things about Muhammad and Islam. This is the symbol for Muhammad, the symbol for Islam. This is the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, and the most sacred shrine of the Muslims, the Al-Kaaba in Mecca. Now, remember I said that Muhammad lived from 570 to 532. Well, 5 years after Muhammad died, Jerusalem fell to the Muslim Caliphate of the time. This was in 637. Soon after, Islam was on the move. And less than 100 years after Muhammad's death in 632, all of the Middle East, all of Saudi Arabia, North Africa, almost all of Spain and Portugal and parts of southern France had fallen to Islam. The Berber invasion of the Iberian Peninsula in 711 was part of that amazing expansion of Islam. What the expansion of Islam meant to the Holy Land was that by the 11th century, pilgrimage to Jerusalem had become a very dangerous, almost a nearly impossible ordeal. So instead of going to Jerusalem, pilgrims started to go to Santiago de Compostela. And they went to Compostela because in the 9th century, if you remember, 814 to be exact, the bones of St. James were discovered in the Campus Stellae, in the field of stars, the word Compostela. Well, the medieval pilgrimage to Santiago really peaked between the 11th and the 13th centuries. Now, here's something important to remember. The 11th century was Christian pushback time. At the beginning of the 11th century, there was serious talk about retaking Jerusalem, the Holy Land, a holy war, the Christian version of jihad. The first crusade was announced in 1095 when Pope Urban II encouraged, and some say incited or commanded, the retaking of the Holy Land. The Pope offered indulgences, and said that anyone who went would have all sins pardoned. And indeed, 4 years after Urban's speech, the Christians regained control of Jerusalem. This was at the end of the First Crusade, 1099. Now, we don't often hear much about this, but this is an interesting side note because the retaking of Jerusalem was a horrifically bloody event. When the walls of Jerusalem were breached, a massacre ensued. Chroniclers from those times say that blood ran ankle deep in some of the streets. And in the Temple of Solomon, where many Jews and Muslims defenders had gone to seek refuge, all of them were killed. And tens of thousands of men, women, and children were slaughtered. Almost the entire population of Jerusalem was killed. This was an interesting note because it was really one of the first examples of not only, but one of the first examples of jihad, Christian jihad. The retaking of Jerusalem is an important part of this story because it highlights when the Templars were founded, when they came into being. A small number of knights, 9 to be exact, who had taken part in the siege of Jerusalem, decided to remain behind in the Temple of Solomon to take care of pilgrims and to protect them. Over the years, their numbers grew, and at some point, they decided to take vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, like most religious orders, and they adopted a rule that was modeled after the rule of Saint Benedict, a very common monastic rule. So 30 years after the retaking of Jerusalem, the poor knights of the Temple of Solomon petitioned the Pope and were recognized as a religious militant order by the church. Over the next 200 years or so, the order thrived and their numbers grew to somewhere between 15 and 20,000, some say even more. The Templars were ferocious knights. They never surrendered, we're told, and that dying in battle for them was assurance that they would have a place in heaven. The order prospered and became wealthy. Young men all over Europe flocked to become knights and to become part of the order. And the order became rich. They became wealthy, inherited small and huge estates all over Europe. And they did put their wealth to use. They built churches and oratories and shrines, and they built fortresses, especially fortresses in the Middle East. He also set up a bank for pilgrims. This was one of the first banks in the world, and they lent money. Eventually, the Templars became very rich and very powerful, which unfortunately led to their undoing. Now, here's an important detail that led to the demise of the Templars. Many people don't know this, but 10 years after the Templars were founded, they became untouchable. And by untouchable, I mean that they were becoming an international phenomenon. And the Pope, in order to protect them from being pulled apart financially or as far as a religious order, he He said that they would be immune from all secular power. This meant that they the Templars were not subject to any sovereign ruler except the Pope himself, and uh, therefore the Templars could travel with impunity throughout the Holy Land and all over Europe. This meant that as they became more wealthy and more powerful, they became like, in some countries especially, like a state within a state. And unfortunately and tragically, um, their increasing popularity, wealth, and power contributed to their downfall. And this is how that happened. At this point, Philip IV, back over here, King of France, comes into the story. As I mentioned, Philip IV was a handsome man, and but we also know that he did some pretty bad things. And this is my picture of the bad Philip. Philip became king at 17. We know that, but by the time he was 46, he had amassed a huge national debt, and uh, part of the debt was inherited from his father, but most of it was a result of his own wars and his mismanagement. To make ends meet, however, Philip had to borrow heavily from French Jews, Lombard bankers, and the Templars. When it became clear that he couldn't pay his debts, he devised this nefarious plan. And here's Philip's nefarious plan. He began to tax the church and expropriate their lands from rich abbots and monasteries. And then he decided that he needed to zero out his debts. So he was going to get rid of his lenders. He expelled from France all Jewish and Lombard bankers, and he expropriated their wealth and their holdings. Then he turned his attention to the Templars. He wanted to eliminate them and to confiscate, by then, their immense wealth. And finally, he planned to do all of this with the help of the Pope, with the church blessing. But as you know, Philip had a problem because the Templars were immune to any secular power. He couldn't touch them. So to get around this immunity, he decided to perhaps have the Inquisition help him. And here's a few words just about the Inquisition. In those days, the Inquisition was immensely powerful. Heretics were frequently brought up before the Inquisition on a number of fairly predictable charges. And after a bit of torture, almost everyone either died or confessed to accusations of heresy, idolatry, devil worship, blasphemy, even sodomy. Those were the usual religious charges that people were accused of in those days that the Inquisition took care of. Now back to Philip. And this is what Philip decided to do. Because he had no authority over the Templars, he couldn't bring any secular charges up against them. So he decided to have the Inquisition do his work for him. And to do that, he had a number of people accuse the Templars of the usual religious charges, heresy, blasphemy, sodomy. And guess what? Uh, the Pope, there was no problem because the Pope at the time, Philip's ally, Clement V, could be pressured to do anything he wanted. Philip's treachery was this, pretending that he was a fervent Christian and against all forms of heresy. He proposed to arrest all Templars in France and turn them over to the Inquisition to be tried on religious charges, not secular charges. And so it happened. On Friday, October 13th, 1307, early in the morning, soldiers all over France stormed every single Templar church, oratory, and house and arrested as many as they could find. But only about 600 were actually caught. Most Templars are escaping to Spain, Portugal, England, and Scotland. Those that were caught, and Jacques de Molay included among them, were jailed, tortured, and forced to confess. Now, to make matters even worse for the Templars, Clement V bolstered Philip's plan by ordering the arrest of all Templars, not only the Templars in France, but Templars in all of Christendom. Fortunately, this decree was largely ignored outside of France. Then Clement administered the coup de grace by a papal decree in 1312. Philip abolished the Order of Templars. In one fell swoop, the religious order of the Templars ceased to exist. And so that ended about 200 years of the existence of the poor knights of the Temple of Solomon. Now, talked about the Templars a little bit, Philip. Now let's turn our attention to Clement. In those days, much as it is today, popes are traditionally selected from the College of Cardinals. But Bertrand de Got was not a cardinal. He was not a prince of the church. And he was just an ordinary French bishop who had been handpicked by Philip to become pope. Bertrand was a Frenchman through and through. He had lived his entire life in France, and he did not get along well with the Italian cardinals in Rome. In fact, he was in France, not in Rome, when he heard that he had been elected pope. And to underscore his servitude to Philip, Clement decided that his coronation would not be in Rome, as was usually done, but he decided that his coronation was going to be in Lyon, France. France. Now, let me interject here, just a little bit of an aside, an important note about popes and kings in those days. Popes before Clement had held tightly that the power of the church was the greatest power on earth, greater than that of any sovereign. And that by the time Philip came on the scene, there had already been many, many years of infighting and intrigue between popes and especially the kings of France about who had the greater power. When Philip came on the scene, this infighting became even more intense. To understand this then red hot debate, we have to go back 500 years, a little bit of history here, to Charlemagne. Um, the story goes that when Charlemagne was crowned emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, the Pope placed the crown on Charlemagne's head. And for everyone, this meant that the church had the greatest power, and that the secular power of any king, was a derivative of the power of the church. The church held that its power came directly from God and was absolute. And because of this, the church would not subject itself to any secular ruler, and its wealth couldn't be taxed. But we have Clement here. We know that Philip disagreed and went ahead and imposed taxes on the church, confiscated property, because basically he needed the wealth of the church. And he got away with all of this because he had bullied and suborned the College of Cardinals to elect his own guy, Bertrand de God, who then became Clement V. In a way, this is like packing the Supreme Court. So it makes findings in your favor. It's been going on for a long time. Philip believed that he had the greatest power. And he was over the church, and he wanted the church under his thumb because he wanted its wealth. And Clement basically supported that. After Clement's coronation, he decided to stay in France, close to Philip, and didn't go back to Rome as expected of any pope. And to please Philip even further, Clement did something unheard of. He moved the entire papal court and administration from Rome to Avignon, France. And thus, among other things, Clement is credited with the beginning of what's called the 67-year Avignon papacy, also known as the Babylon captivity of the papacy. Clement was an embarrassment and is an embarrassment to the papacy. He gave the church a black eye for not only moving the papacy to Avignon, but more so for giving up the independence of the church and allowing it to be effectively controlled by a secular king. To be kind, or in all fairness to Clement, he was a weak man, and he was a victim of his time. But there were worse popes. Poor Clement doesn't hold a candle to the monster popes of the 15th century. Rodrigo Borgia and Giuliano della Rovere, the Alexander VI during the time of Isabel, and Alexander VI and Julius II. And of course, there are other monster popes, the infamous Medici popes, Giovanni and Giulio. From the beginning, Clement was in Philip's back pocket, and there he remained until he died. Here are a couple of pictures of Clement as Pope. And this picture of Pope is kind of interesting because no one seems to be very happy in this image. Now I'd like to introduce Jacques de Molay. And let's get the bad news out of the way first. He was burned at the stake. It was a pretty awful way to die, but it was the way reserved for heretics. But he wasn't a heretic, he was framed. Some background on Jacques de Molay. He was born in 1244 to a mid-level noble family in France. Um, he joined the Templars when he was 26, and he was knighted at the same time. And shortly after he was knighted, he was sent to the Middle East, to the Templar houses in the Middle East. But the Middle East was in turmoil. See, 100 years before Jacques de Molay arrives in the Middle East, the city of Jerusalem and other cities in the Holy Lands had fallen to Islam. So Jacques de Molay was sent into a war zone. Pardon me. We don't know much about him over the next 20 years or so until the year 1291. And that year is significant because it's the year that the city of Acre fell to Islam. Acre was the last Christian city and Templar fortress in the Holy Land. And because it fell, all Templars had to flee to the island of Rhodes. And it's precisely at this time when the Templars have to escape to Rhodes that Jacques de Molay becomes a major force within the Templars. He was elected the 23rd Grand Master of the order, but immediately was faced with this enormous task. The entire purpose of the Templars had changed. Because Acre, Jerusalem, all the Holy Land had fallen to Islam, pilgrims could no longer literally travel to the Middle East. And the Templars would no longer be able to protect any of the Christian shrines. This was their work. So their purpose in the work had to evolve. And to adjust to this change, this radical change in the purpose of the Templars, Jacques de Molay, as Grand Master, laid out a plan to reform the order. But back in France, Philip had other ideas. He had been lobbying the Pope to merge the Templars with the Knights Hospitallers. This was a militant religious order in France under the control of Philip. And if he were successful in this merger of the two orders, he would be able to control the Templars and confiscate their wealth. Jacques de Molay obviously objected to these overtures. And this is where everything goes wrong. This is where the fascinating story. Oops, I didn't show these slides there. Here's just a story, an image of the fall of Acre as its walls are breached, and this is a story, or this picture has a story of the utter despair of the Templars as they had to leave the Holy Land and to rethink who they were as a militant religious order. Going back, the story is that the Templars and Jacques de Molay, Philip, and Clement all clash at this point. And that's because Philip puts his plan into motion, into action. He's going to get rid of the Templars, he's going to confiscate their wealth, and he's going to cancel his debts to everyone. And he's going to do this by having the Inquisition do his work for him and bring up the Templars on fake religious charges. And obviously part of the plan was that Clement was going to go along with Philip's plan. He was not going to object, and he didn't. And so it happened, as I had said before, in the early morning of October 13th, 1307, with the support of the Inquisition, Philip sent his troops to arrest all Templars. Unfortunately, most of the Templars had been tipped off and either fled or went into hiding. But as I also mentioned, about 600 Templars, including Jacques de Molay, were captured, arrested, and imprisoned. They all were tortured, and not surprisingly, they all confessed. Here's an interesting detail. Shortly after he was arrested, Jacques de Molay was interviewed by emissaries from Clement V, and he recanted his confession. But Philip put him back in prison. He was tortured again, and again he confessed. This imprisonment went on for 7 years. About midway during this imprisonment, these 7 years, in the year 1310, about 54 Templars are burned at the stake. And 4 years later, on March 18, 1314, 4 more Templars are scheduled to be burned at the stake. These included Jacques de Molay. But for one reason or another, only 2 were executed that day. A man by the name of Geoffrey de Charnay and Jacques de Molay. Here's a quote about what happened that day. At sunset, a pyre was erected in the shadows of Notre Dame near the palace garden. There, Jacques de Molay and Geoffrey de Charnay were slowly burned to death, refusing all offers for retraction. Bearing their torment with composure, they won for themselves the reputation of martyrs among the people, who reverently collected their ashes as relics. Jacques de Molay was 70 years old when he died. He had been the Grand Master of the Templars for 20 years, their last Grand Master. This plaque is on the Ile de la Cité, there in the shadows of Notre Dame Cathedral. It says, in this place, à cet endroit, Jacques de Molay, last Grand Master of the Order of the Temple, a été brûlé. He was burned on March 18, 1314. The story of the Templars could end here with the death of Jacques de Molay and the dissolution of the Templars. But the story really doesn't end here, because there are several interesting footnotes to the story. The first is called The Curse of Jacques de Molay. This is interesting because some say that as Jacques de Molay was being burned to death, he cursed Philip and Clement, having unjustly tried and condemned him. Others say that it really wasn't a curse at all. It was a solemn invitation for Philip and Clement to join him before the throne of Almighty God, so that God could decide who had been truthful and just and who had not. What happened soon after Jacques' death was really spooky. I don't know if you know this, but within the month, Clement died. When he was lying in state, the church where his body had been laid out was struck by lightning, and his body was almost completely destroyed by fire. And something happened to Philip too. Um, in November of the same year, 1314, in a hunting accident, Philip dies. And not only that, some few years after Philip's death, his house, his name, his legacy was eliminated when his three sons and a grandson also died. A bit spooky, no? The second footnote to the story of the Templars is about the Chinon parchments. Chinon parchments. I don't know if you know about these, but it may be hard to believe this. But 19 years ago, in the year 2001, in the secret archives of the Vatican, an astonishing discovery was made. An Italian researcher, a paleographer, a researcher of ancient documents, a woman by the name of Barbara Frale, discovered two long buried documents. One was a papal decree issued in or dated in 1308. 1308, so that's a year after Jacques de Molay was arrested and 6 years before he was burned at the stake. In this document, Clement states that he absolved Jacques de Molay and all Templars of the charges that had been brought against them. A second document was also discovered, and this was a letter from Clement to Philip. And it's also dated 1308, in which Clement tells Philip that he, the Pope, absolved the Templars, all the Templars who had confessed, and, quote, restored these Templars to the sacraments and the unity of the church. For some unknown reason, these documents never saw the light of day until 2001. The presumption is that they were sent and received. Oops, sorry about that. The third footnote is about the Camino de Santiago and about where today we can find reminders of the Templars. The Templar castle in Ponferrada is a great example of the work of the Templar, their wealth and their strength as a militant religious order. Jacques de Molay is said to have left his sword there on his way to Santiago. Some say that the 12th century chapels in Eunate and in Torres del Rio were built by Templars. And these are today serene reminders of, on the Camino Frances, of the times of the Templars and their memory. Another place is where you'll see reminders of the Templars is west of León, between Carrión de los Condes and El Burgo Ranero. There's a little town called Terradillos de los Templarios. In this little town, there's an albergue named after Jacques de Molay, and it's dedicated to him and the memory of the Templars. There are also many, many reminders of the Templars in Portugal. One of the largest is the not on the Camino itself, but it's a castle at Tomar. It's a huge castle. It was built in 1160, and it's a testimony to the Templars' presence in Portugal, to pushing back the the Islamic invaders from the Iberian Peninsula in 711. The fourth and final footnote is about a question. And the question is, are the Templars with us even today? We all know that on Friday the 13th, October 1307, there were thousands of Templars in France and throughout Europe. And we also know that only 600 were arrested and imprisoned. Now, current thinking is that the Templars who were not rounded up by Philip fled to other countries that were beyond the control of Philip or Clement. And remember that Templars were monks. So when the Templar order was expired, when they were abolished, many of these fugitive monks really went back and to find other orders, other militant orders that existed at the time. In France, there was mainly the Knights Hospitallers. In Portugal, there was the Order of Christ that had its headquarters in Tomar. And in Spain, there were 4 different orders that welcomed Templars. There was the Order of Montesa, the Order of Calatrava, Order of Alcántara, and the largest of all, the Order of Santiago. They're called the Caballeros de Santiago. In Galicia, just before Palas de Reis, is a little chapel in Pilar das Donas that has sarcophagi of the Caballeros de Santiago. By the way, these 4 orders exist today. They're no longer religious orders, but they're civic and honorary associations. Even today, echoes of the Templars abound. There are legends about the Templars. There are stories about their still undiscovered wealth, their treasures. Stories about the Holy Grail are very much alive, especially in England and in Scotland. And of course, most recently, the Da Vinci Code, Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code, is a good read about all these stories. And now this is the end of my story about the legendary warrior monks of the called the Templars. I focused my story on the latter years of the rich history of the Templars. And I'm leaving it up to you to read more about the early years of these brave knights, and to read more about the amazing life of Jacques de Molay, and also to appreciate the legacy that the Templars have left us, especially along the Camino de Santiago. Thank you.
Right.
Thank you all very much. And to each and every one of you, un buen camino.
Thank you, Emilio. There's a lot of people clapping here. That was wonderful. Thank you so much. And we're getting thumbs up here too.
Okay.
So we can allow you guys, if you want to comment or if you have something to say or contribute, you can unmute yourself and ask, and we'll try to keep this somewhat orderly. But I will also go through the chat and see if there's any questions. But if anybody would like to speak up, unmute yourself and or wave your hand wildly, and you have the mic.
I'd love to ask a question of Emilio.
Okay.
Emilio, I wonder what you think of these kind of new Templars that are appearing on the Camino. I've encountered them in Vega de Valcarce and in Melide, and there are men who are kind of forming a neo-Templar consciousness. What do you think of this?
Well, I think it's a noble effort. I mean, the Templars were exemplary protectors of pilgrims, and I think in all those cases, they're not warriors. They're really there as a symbolic representation of folks, protecting pilgrims and that watching over pilgrims. So it's actually, I think, touching. I mean, they I don't think they're organizing themselves as a religious order or militant order, but it is a nice touch.
Yeah, I agree. It's like hospitaleros, the hospitality of the community.
roaming hospitaleros, exactly right. Yeah.
That's lovely. Thank you.
So I have a question, and I guess it kind of piggybacks on you guys's about like the role of the Templars along the route. Do we have documentation of exactly what that looked like on a kind of day-to-day basis? I mean, were they known for like riding the Camino and like protecting? Are we talking physically? Like what exactly did they do to protect pilgrims? How did it look on a day-to-day basis?
Well, many pilgrims were prey to bandits. There are stories even in the Codex Calixtinus about the routes there through what was then Navarra and the Basque country. That early part of the Camino Frances was a perilous journey, during the Middle Ages. So I would imagine, I don't know for sure, but I would imagine there was physical protection, and kind of policing that might have been going on during much of the Middle Ages.
Excuse me for interrupting, Emilio. Are there any did anybody leave any records? Do we have any sort of record of firsthand
of actions by the Templars?
Yeah, their presence and firsthand accounts. Just anybody, is anything left behind?
There probably are, but I'm not aware of them. But that's an excellent question. Actually, I will look into that, because that would be, evidence, not just simply that they were there, but that they were performing a function, and what specifically that function was. So good question, Kelly. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, Emilio, Frank and Tahoe. When I was researching Italy, I found the Knights of Tau. And I was wondering if you found any relationship between them and the Knights Templar.
Well, there were militant orders all over Europe. For example, in the Germanic countries, there were the Teutonic Knights, and there were several other orders, even in France. In the Middle Ages, in the Middle East, there were probably others too. So there were many, and I would imagine the Tau being a symbol, of Christ was something that they had organized around. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. It was the same mission where they would protect pilgrims and kind of beckon them in with bells and churches and things. If it was
when the Templars were in the Middle East, defending pilgrims. There were other militant orders also doing the same thing. So it wasn't just the Templars. You know, others were there too.
Thanks.
Emilio, today there is a youth society called de Molay. Do you know anything about it and how it came to be?
Is that a Masonic?
I don't know.
I think it has some connection with the Masons.
I really don't know.
And de Molay, yeah. And I think, you know, I don't know if there's any direct connection, but the Masons actually did adopt many of the rituals or presumed Templar rituals into their own internal organization, and so they do have this concept of being knights, and in protection of values of truth and so on. So, but I am not a Mason, so I can't tell you more about that.
Emilio,
If I'm not mistaken, I'm sorry, if I'm not mistaken, the de Molay is the female arm of the Masons.
No. I was a de Molay when I was a teenager.
Young men.
Let's listen to Mike Miller. Yeah.
Okay. Hi. I was a teenager once upon a time, a long time ago, and I was a de Molay. It is a sort of a youth group that are sponsored by the Masons.
Knights of Columbus.
No, that's the Catholic organization.
Oh, sorry.
The counterpart for young women is Job's Daughters.
Eastern.
I see. Yeah, and they have this concept of being noble, of a knighthood, I mean, was that part of that?
That was a small part of my experience, but I did not. I was not a member of the de Molays for very long. I was just for about a year and a half. So I can't really speak too much.
Well,
about
that's good information. Thanks, Mike.
I can remember growing up, going to dances put on by the de Molay Society.
Was there anything particular about the dances being just a dance or an average kind of dance, or was there something?
They were for junior high students, and I was forbidden to go. I was Catholic, and they were, but I did go several times, and it was probably the first time in my life that we had mixed dances. Yeah, I mean, so it was early, probably late grade school, early high school, before I started going to sock hops.
I can remember this would be in about the early 60s. I had friends who were Job's Daughters, but I could not go because I was Catholic. So I couldn't go to their dances or their things.
I mean, you could go because of your parents' admonitions. They weren't checking you at the door.
I must have been able to go to see this girl be coronated or something, but I couldn't participate or be a member.
But your parents would let you go?
No, it had nothing to do with my parents. So I must have been to the point where I got to go to observe stuff, but I couldn't be a member, I guess would be the thing. Yeah. Because I was Catholic. Yeah. And it's funny because I think the Knights of Templars is Christian, and I think of Christianity often as Catholicism. And I guess I get all messed up there.
Yeah. I want to, if you haven't been inside the castle in Ponferrada, it is an amazing structure, and of course they've decorated it up so it looks very modern and sort of Camelot-like. But the structure itself is amazing. And the other point I mentioned was this little town. It's if you're on the Camino Francés and you're going from Melide to Palas de Reis, there's I think it's a 2-kilometer a walk away from I don't know what direction, north I guess, to this little town. It's really just a few little houses and an old monastery. Actually, it was a convent that has in it the sarcophagi of the Templars, not the Templars, but the Caballeros de Santiago. So they were descendants of the Templars. And you see the Templar cross is actually in some of the stone, and it is really one of the few small, well-preserved remnants or reminders of the Templars and their descendants. So it's a place.
There's also
Amelia,
the,
we have Lisa Hetler Smith was raising her hand. So go ahead, Lisa, you have the floor.
Hi, speaking of Pomferrada, back in 2015, my son walked the Camino with some friends. It's what gave me the inspiration to do it the next year. And he was walking with a friend whose last name is Valcarce, and his whole family was from that part of Spain. When they got to Pomferrada, they knew his friend had friends there. And they found out that there's actually a whole Templar movement there. They actually have a very large group. And they were having an investiture of new Templars at the Ponferrada Castle. It was a private ceremony. So they were invited to attend, and they stood in the galleries up above that big courtyard. And I have a picture. If you can enable screen share somehow, I can show you. It's a fantastic picture.
Oh,
Lisa,
wow.
I've heard of that too from Rennie, who lives in Ponferrada. There are very active Templar rites over there. So I allowed you to share your screen. Do you want to go ahead and do that real quickly?
Oh, okay, good.
Show us
Here we
that photo?
go. Yes. There we go.
There.
So
wow.
you can all see that.
Wow.
Yes.
He said it was really very solemn, and they had all sorts of, special ways they were doing stuff. The friend was explaining everything, but I thought that's just really beautiful.
That was 5 years ago?
That was in 2015, yeah. In the spring of 2015.
Wow, that's great.
Yeah, it was pretty cool. He said they were all the main focus was doing good works. That is kind of a charity organization. How that got started in nowadays, I have no idea. So anyway, okay.
Thank you, Lisa.
I
That's
will,
really cool to see.
if anybody wants, how about if I send a copy of that to Laurie, maybe?
Sure, I can share that out.
And then if anybody wants it, they can contact her. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah,
Okay.
Thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you very much, Lisa. Yeah.
Does anybody else have something that they haven't spoken up yet?
I had a question. As you walk into Santiago, a few miles from the cathedral, you see this rather handsome statue of a Templar. It has a very simple inscription on it, as I recall. It just says, "To the Pilgrim Templars," or do you know anything about that statue? It looks like a modern statue. It doesn't look old or anything, but it's.
Yeah. You know what? I don't know anything about this, but I know the statue that you're referring to. I think I have a picture of it somewhere. Yeah. That it's an impressive, warrior knight. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
How did the Templars acquire all their wealth? Were there being a religious order, did families, nobles, whatever, give their lands to the order as a way of getting indulgence, or what?
Great question, because you have to remember that that the 11th, 12th, even 13th centuries, the faith ran everything. Everything was about one's faith, and so the Crusades, and they were probably what I've counted, or I've seen one source that says that they were 8, and another that said that they were 11 Crusades. So each one of those was this huge outpouring of devotion, and of course human sacrifice, because they were going to war. And so a lot of the families that were going, or that had young men going there, would donate, to the Templar, to the order itself. So the order was very much organized in Europe and in the Holy Land. So they were smart. They were smart people. They actually did bank. They did take on the ownership of estates, and so those estates generated money, and slowly they really developed into probably, you know, one of the richest, you know, I describe them like a state within a state, organizations within any country. And so, you know, they developed, you know, they're a banking system, and they lent money. So, and as I mentioned, you know, that financial aspect was one of the things that drew a lot of attention to them, and really resulted in their demise, because that's what people wanted, their wealth. And they owned huge estates all over Europe, and each estate actually generated its own wealth.
So money,
Emilio, we have
money,
a couple
money
of
makes the
hands
world go
up.
around.
Pardon me?
Money makes the world go around. The world go around.
It did then
True.
too, as we
So
can
a
see.
few hands have
Still
been
does.
up for a while. I just want to ask Christine Helwick to unmute yourself, because
Oh.
we're, yes.
What's the story about all the octagonal churches?
Good question.
Well, you know, and you're talking about Torres del Rio and Eonate. You know, there isn't really any evidence that those were Eonate and Torres del Rio were built by the Templars, but that's the general belief, because the eight-sided chapel is a representation of you know, I could be wrong about
I thought it was
does
based
somebody
on,
know about it's the Holy Sepulchre, I
Yeah.
think, that has 8 sides.
Right.
You know, so it's already the dimensions and form design of a holy place. So I think that's maybe explains why we have Eonate in that form.
Thank you,
Wait,
Emilio.
Does that get to what you were saying or asking?
Yeah, I just was aware of several of them along the Camino and never knew the significance of their being octagonal.
Yeah, it's I think the connection with the form of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem.
Okay, I see Margaret, you have your hand up. Did you have a question? Unmute yourself.
Emilio, you mentioned several militant religious groups around the world or Europe.
Yeah.
What was the reason? What did religious groups need a military for all over the place? What were they defending or absconding, or what was the purpose of all these military religious groups?
Well, it was war, holy war.
Against who?
Well, against Islam, against
Okay.
the fact that that Islam had invaded and basically prevented Christians from going to the Holy Land, to Jerusalem. And so, you know, the Templars were supposedly had relics of the Holy Cross and other relics, you know, even legends of the Grail, you know, that they were protecting. And so, you know, those were incredibly powerful objects, you know, that people wanted to defend. And so, and different countries would send the smaller groups that were organized like the Templars, not necessarily all of them as a religious militant order. And remember, the Templars were monks. They actually had an internal rule, much like the rule of Saint Benedict. So there were some differences on it, but they were they were religious in that sense, and others were maybe more soldiers.
All against Islam.
Yeah, it was basically against Islam. And then when the Holy Land fell, then in 1291, when Acre fell, and really that was the end of the story. All of them had to rewrite their basic plan, their orders, their rule, and so that's when many of them then either joined other orders or just disappeared.
Right. I don't see any other hands up. I see a lot of activity in the chat. So I will be saving this chat transcript and sharing it. Oh, wait, I see some hands up. Lynn Ashcraft Yonoshiro.
Well, it's Maria.
Hi, Maria.
I really, hi, Emilio. Thank you, gracias. But I have so many interesting questions. So I have this book in case someone want to do further reading. And it's about the Knight Templars in the Golden Age of Spain, their hidden history on the Iberian Peninsula. Wow, and it's written by Atienza. That is a great writer that he specialized in medieval story in Spain. So that's all of you, if you want for further reading, because I seem everybody's interested in the Templars.
Yeah. Thank you, Maria. Laurie, can you put a reference to that into the chat, or at least the part of the title and the author?
Yes, I'm on it.
Yeah. Here's that book by and actually Rob told me about this, so I went ahead.
I was just going to mention it, but go ahead.
It's the Templars, and it has a foreword by Umberto Eco, really a well-known Italian novelist. And it's called The Templars, The Secret Story Revealed. And this is the book by Barbara Frale. So it actually is this, it's not stories, it's actually her research, and especially the discovery of those documents that saw light in 2001. So she really did a real contribution.
Yeah, and it says that she was the Vatican Archives historian here. I don't know what that meant. So I guess she had access to a lot of the archives. And
yeah, I mean, not everybody has that access to that.
I actually picked this up at one of our potlucks where people, we have the table where we, the flea market table. And somebody had put this down on that. And I said, oh, well, that looks sort of interesting. So sometimes you find good things at the flea market.
Yeah. One little footnote, additional footnote is that, some years ago, I think it was maybe around 2005 or so, some people who claimed that they were descendants of the Templars made a formal request to the Vatican for their response to the Chinon parchments and what had happened, make some official statement. And it actually did come from Benedict XVI, Joseph Ratzinger, my friend Joe, who made an announcement about, it was in 2011, an announcement about the Templars where he actually made a formal apology for the execution of Jacques de Molay. But what was really telling that there was no response to the papal involvement in the murders of the Templars. Clement was silent about Clement. He was just sorry that it all happened. But so it was kind of a muted apology.
I'd also like to just say something about one of the octagonal churches, Eunate. if you haven't been to Eonate, it's only about 2 kilometers off the main track, and it's well worth it. It's a very small chapel, and when I was there, we were told it was supposedly built by the Templars, but who knows? But it's definitely a worthy diversion from the Camino.
Yeah, I would put that to be one of the treasures along the Camino.
Right.
That chapel is amazing. I mean, they claim that the magnetic forces of the planet or something are in there, but there is something really amazing about that place. If you ever have a chance to sit in that chapel for 15, 20 minutes, it is amazing.
All right, we are coming to the end time of our wonderful, lively discussion here. And thank you so much, everybody, for joining, and special thanks to Emilio for a great presentation.
Thank you, Emilio.
Thank
Thank
you.
Round of applause.
Thank you, Emilio.
All right. Thank you. All right.
And I will share the transcript of chat on our NorCal Facebook group. And if you have any other questions, you can email Emilio about them, right, Emilio?
Yeah.
Templar questions?
Yeah, stop, so.
Yeah, and there's a lot of good shares, so thanks for participating, and it's really great seeing everybody.
Great seeing everybody. Thank you again.
Thank you, Emilio. I always think of October of the Friday the 13th now differently.
Yes.
I know.
I'll think of the Templars. Thank you. Bye.
Take care, everyone.
Bye, Emilio. Thank you, Laurie.
Thank you.
Laurie.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Happy Friday. I think
Thank
it was
you.
a lucky one for us.
Yes, thank you. Bye.